Welcome back to Origin Seminar. Today's speaker is Terry Suer. Terry has received PhD at Sorbonne University and then had a postdoc at Harvard, and now a research scientist in University of Rochester and visiting us at University of Arizona as part of Alien Earth astrobiology team. So she's interested in the early time planet formation, especially Earth formation and high pressure, very early, planet formation times. So we'll hear the distribution of volatile elements during rocky planet formation today. So Terry, take it away.
Thank you. Okay, so I'll talk to you a little bit about the distribution of volatile elements in the early Earth and other rocky planets. And I'll do so from the perspective of laboratory measurements that are key inputs to models of planetary differentiation and atmospheric outgassing. So the elements that I will primarily talk about today are sulfur, nitrogen, carbon, and hydrogen. And these are often referred to as the highly volatiles in planetary context, because they have low boiling points and low condensation temperatures, and they tend to concentrate in atmospheres. So sometimes they are also referred to as atmophiles. One or more of these elements are present in the atmosphere of the Earth and the other rocky bodies in the solar system, and they are expected to dominate the gaseous envelopes of rocky exoplanets. These elements are important for habitability. So amino acids are important components of life as we know it, and I'm showing the chemical structure of the amino acid methionine, which is made up of these four of these elements in addition to oxygen. So oxygen is another important element for habitability, and I will talk about that, but in the context of redox. So there are two questions that motivated the work that I will present today. The first one is, and the talk is divided into two parts in which I try to address each of these questions. So for the first part of the talk, the question that I'm mostly interested in is how can we quantify volatiles in the Earth and other rocky planets? And the work that I'll present is based on a forthcoming review paper by myself and a few collaborators, in which we collected the metal-silicate partitioning data from the literature, as well as the magma solubility data for the four highly volatile elements, and combined them in a way that is accessible to a general audience, not necessarily just experimentalists. And I would like to acknowledge the collaborators that I worked with on this part of the talk. The second question that I will try to address is concerning the Earth's volatile chronology, and I will present recent measurements on elements that they themselves are not highly volatiles, but they can be used to trace volatile accretion. And this is work that I did as part of my postdoc, and I would like to acknowledge my postdoc advisor and the team that I worked with on this part of the talk. So if we can understand how the Earth acquired its volatiles and how those became redistributed, we can apply this understanding to rocky planets elsewhere. This is a very active field of research within planetary science, particularly as astronomers are on the verge of being able to detect atmospheres, or already have, of extrasolar rocky planets. So we can begin to quantify Earth's volatiles today by assuming some bulk composition. Usually we assume some primitive meteoritic bulk composition, such as carbonaceous chondrites, and apply a mass balance argument to that. But this doesn't really tell us, it doesn't really help us to understand how the volatiles became internally redistributed. So another approach would be to ask, where are Earth's volatiles today and how did they get there? So this is a general picture of the Earth's interior today. There is a dense iron core that is surrounded by, there's a dense iron core that has an inner solid core surrounded by a liquid outer core. And this is surrounded by a less dense silicate mantle and a less dense crust, hydrosphere, and atmospheres. And the hydrosphere and the atmosphere are where we typically think volatiles accumulated. But seismology tells us that the Earth's core is not pure iron, and that it must contain about 10% lighter components. And 3 of the elements that have been proposed to explain this density deficit are highly volatiles. So how did these elements end up in the core? We think that the composition of both the core and the mantle were set very early on while planet formation was ongoing. So in order to understand how volatiles ended up where they were in the Earth and in other planets, we need to understand these early planetary processes that were fractionated and redistributed volatiles. So if we consult the geochemical record, there's evidence for volatile-related processes. And these are the 3 main ones that we have uncovered. The first one is devolatilization, which occurred very early in the Earth's history while it was still forming. And the second one is differentiation and magma outgassing. These are thought to be related to the formation of the core and the outgassing of a secondary atmosphere. And then later in Earth's history, after the core had formed, it appears as though there was a delivery of volatiles again. So of these 3 mechanisms, the one that my colleagues and I focused on was differentiation and magma outgassing, and we tried to understand how these 2 processes redistributed volatiles and the fundamental information that we need to model these processes in the Earth, and how those can be extended to other planets as well. Okay, so this stage of the Earth's growth included wide-scale melting induced by impacts that were energetic enough to melt the entire mantle. In this setting, the metal cores of these impactors are thought to have dispersed and equilibrated in the magma ocean before merging with the core. So this was both a physical and a chemical separation process. Sorry, my pointer. This is both a physical and a chemical separation process, and the main chemical reaction that we think occurred was this redox reaction between iron and iron oxide, by which iron became reduced out of the magma ocean to form the core. So the other elements in the Earth, including the volatile elements, also participated in similar redox reactions. And if we want to quantify how this large-scale differentiation of metal from silicate, if we want to quantify how much material was transferred during this process, the information that we need are the metal-silicate partition coefficients for all of the elements that we're trying to study. The second process that I mentioned was the outgassing of a secondary atmosphere. So there was interaction between magmas and gas going on simultaneously with differentiation. And at this point in Earth's history, it's thought that a secondary atmosphere became outgassed. So the fundamental information that we need to model the transfer of material during that process are the magma solubilities for the highly volatile elements. So my colleagues and I, as I mentioned earlier, we collected the partition coefficients and the solubilities of the 4 highly volatile elements. And that is most of the work that I will present to you in this talk. So first I will present the partition coefficients and then the solubilities. And I just wanted to point out that most of the partition coefficients that we collected were acquired at conditions that are relevant to the formation of smaller bodies like planetesimals and planetary embryos. And only recently have there been measurements at conditions that are relevant to final equilibration between Earth's core and mantle. And those conditions I'm showing here are between 45 and 65 GPa on average pressures and temperatures above 3,500 Kelvin. And there's also a lot of recent work done on measuring solubilities for these elements. And this is a very active area of research, not just in understanding the early Earth's atmosphere, but to understand the atmosphere of Venus, Mars as well. And these data are being increasingly applied to understanding extrasolar rocky planets. So moving on. Okay, so here I'm showing a plot of magnesium and silicon content in a number of bodies, and magnesium and silicon are major planet forming material, and I'm like this plot is showing the Earth, the other rocky bodies in the solar system, overlaid onto stellar and white dwarf pollution spectra, onto putative planetary composition derived from stellar and white dwarf pollution spectra. And the main point of this plot is just to illustrate that there are similarities between the composition of the Earth and putative planetary objects in other systems. And to first order, what this implies is that if we can understand how the Earth formed, maybe similar processes are occurring in these other systems, and we can apply our understanding to those systems as well. So this plot doesn't yet capture volatile elements, but this is hopefully something that we will have very soon from JWST observations.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
The moon is quite different from the Earth here?
Yes.
Okay.
The moon is more volatile. It has lost more volatiles than the Earth. So yeah, there's a lot of variation, but I think overall there's still similarities. And the yellow is a rock of solar composition. Okay, so the two fractionation processes that I mentioned earlier, core mantle differentiation and magma outgassing, are both redox reactions, and I'm just showing here the generalized form for a redox reaction. And what we need to do as experimentalists is to be able to predict how these redox reactions evolve at different pressure, temperature, and oxygen capacities relevant to your growing planet. And so equilibrium thermodynamics allow us to parametrize these reactions, and I'm showing here a very simplified parametrization for a metal-silicate partition reaction in terms of variables, some of which we can measure, like the pressure, the temperature, and the composition, and some of which we cannot measure, such as the entropy and the volume change. The ones that we can't measure, we can, if we have enough data and we have these functional forms, we can fit to figure out what all these terms are. And then once we have all the terms, we have an equation that we can use to predict how the partition coefficient of an element X would evolve over many different pressure, temperatures, and composition. So this workflow is the same that would be used in the context of the solubility measurements. I just wanted to point out here that the oxygen fugacity can be thought of as the partial pressure of oxygen in your system, or the availability of oxygen in your system. And for the rest of the talk, I will refer to oxygen fugacity in the context of this iron wüstite redox buffer, which is commonly used in earth science. So both the quantities that we reviewed are obtained by measuring the composition of experimental samples. And this is what a sample from a metal-silicate partition experiment looks like. So this particular sample was obtained from a diamond anvil cell experiment, but most of the data that I will show you is actually obtained from other types of apparatus, such as piston cylinder experiments and multi-anvil presses. But the idea behind all of these experiments is the same. There is a magma ocean analog in contact with a core forming analog. They are compressed, heated up until they melt and equilibrate, and then quenched rapidly from these conditions. And then the compositions can be measured afterwards with various probes. in this case, I've used X as the element that we're trying to study. So we're trying to obtain partition coefficient for X. This is a redox reaction by which X is exchanged between metal and silicate. And this is how we would express the partition coefficient. It's basically the ratio of the concentration of element X in the metal over the silicate. So I'm going to present the data that we collected for the 4 highly volatile elements, starting with sulfur. Okay, so sulfur is one of the most widely studied elements in all of earth science. It has a strong affinity for iron at ambient conditions. It's also present in iron meteorites, and is often associated with planetesimal cores and is a candidate light element in the Earth's core. And numerous works have been done to quantify its metal-silicate partition and behavior. And I'm showing most of this work here as the green squares and circles. So I just wanted to point out that log partition coefficient is on the y-axis, and a positive log D means an element likes to be with iron or it is siderophile, and a negative log D means it prefers to be in rocky phases, often referred to as lithophile. And so majority of the sulfur data shows that it favors the metal phase. The blue box is the oxygen fugacity conditions under which the Earth's core is thought to have formed. And on the x-axis is the oxygen fugacity in terms of the iron woostite buffer. Reducing conditions are on the left, and more oxidizing conditions are on the right. I just wanted to remind you also that the partition coefficient is a convolution of many different variables and terms, which I'm showing a simplified example for here. And so it might not be evident if you plot it just as a function of one variable, and trends might not be evident. But it does appear that sulfur remains iron-loving over most of the data that was collected. So if I replot this data set as a function of temperature, it becomes apparent that there's 2 populations of data. Most of the data is at lower pressures and temperatures, and these are relevant to modeling differentiation in planetesimals. And then there's a few recent studies that have obtained data at conditions that are relevant to the formation of Earth's core. So usually what we do when we collect this data is we plot them in terms of one variable, and then we overlay isotherms or isobars. And I'll just quickly go through what this would look like. So I just replotted the data here in terms of pressure. And it's the same data set as I showed before. Lower pressure data in blue, the higher pressure data are the ones in red. The conditions of Earth's core formation are marked by this pink box. And then using the functional form that we derived, we overlaid these isotherms, which show how the sulfur partition coefficient evolves at high pressures and temperatures. And it becomes evident that it's becoming less iron-loving, but it's still fairly iron-loving. And to first order, this implies that most of the sulfur would still end up in the planetary core, but a significant amount of it would end up in the mantle and be available for outgassing. So moving on to nitrogen. So this is the same format as before, log partition coefficient on the y-axis, more siderophile, higher numbers, and lower numbers are less iron-loving. And the data, most of the data are these green squares, so pressures of up to 10 GPa, and there's now a few data points at higher temperatures and pressures that are relevant to formation of the Earth's core. So it appears that nitrogen becomes more siderophile in these high pressure temperature conditions. This is not necessarily something that was expected. Nitrogen is an atmophile, but if this is true, if we can confirm this at higher pressures and temperatures, it means that nitrogen would be increasingly partitioned into large planetary cores. Okay, moving on to carbon. Carbon is an important component of life, and it's essential to various geochemical cycles on the Earth. And in particular, carbon is probably playing an important role in the carbon-silicate cycle that could be occurring on other planets in the solar system, as well as in extrasolar planetary system. And so understanding how it's partitioned up into these various planetary reservoir is really important. So again, most of the data that was collected for carbon are these green squares, so data obtained at conditions relevant to planetesimal formation. But there have been recent studies that have provided partition coefficients at conditions relevant to formation of the Earth's core, and these are the ones that I'm showing here in the red diamonds, and they seem to indicate that carbon becomes a couple of orders of magnitude less iron loving at conditions at which the Earth's core formed at. What this implies is that even though carbon is still very siderophile and it would still be expected to partition into the Earth's core, there would be a lot of carbon partitioning into mantles and would be available for outgassing as well. So, final element that we reviewed was hydrogen. So hydrogen is the most abundant element in the cosmos, but its role in planet formation is not really well understood. And one of the reasons because hydrogen is also the smallest atom, and it's very difficult to contain in experiments, which makes it hard to measure its composition. But a few groups have obtained data on hydrogen. Most of them were obtained at these lower pressures relevant to planetesimal formations, which I'm showing here with the blue squares and circles. And these indicated that hydrogen is a lithophile, so its partition coefficient is negative. The log partition coefficients are negative mostly. There was one early study that indicated it could be a slight siderophile, but more recently, experiments were done in diamond anvil cell showing that hydrogen is behaving as a siderophile or an iron loving element at the conditions that the Earth's core formed at. And to first order, this implies that the Earth's core could contain weight percent levels of hydrogen. So, but there's not a lot of hydrogen even at these lower pressure temperature conditions, and I think in general it would be good to have more hydrogen data to model not just smaller planets, but also Earth-sized planets. Recent work have shown that the Earth could have had a very hydrogen-rich atmosphere. An exoplanetary system, studies of exoplanetary systems have shown that rocky planets elsewhere could have thick hydrogen envelopes, but we don't yet have enough data to really understand how hydrogen would behave during differentiation in those kinds of bodies. And that was the last element that we collected the partition coefficients for. I will now move on to solubilities. So solubility establishes the equilibrium concentration of an element between a magma and an atmosphere. And you can think of it the same way as you think of a partition coefficient, but only this time the two phases are the magma and a gas. And so we did the same thing that we did for the partition coefficients. We collected the solubility data from the literature, but in this case, my colleagues took the additional step of using these solubilities as inputs to magma-gas interaction models, and then use that to predict speciation and concentration of the highly volatiles in both magmas and atmospheres at a range of conditions from very reducing to very oxidizing, with the hope that this would be relevant to scientists that are studying exoplanetary atmospheres. So here I'm showing a speciation map of 3 of the highly volatiles in magmas. The y-axis shows the water content of the magma, and the x-axis shows the oxygen fugacity in terms of the iron wustite buffer, and the formation conditions or the relevant conditions to the Earth and Mars are highlighted, but this map could be relevant to other planetary bodies as well. So magma content plays an important role in the atmospheric content. And here I'm showing the results of more modeling that was carried out by my colleagues. This time, each plot is showing the atmosphere magma ocean partition coefficient as a function of redox and different gas pressures. And so I'll just walk through each of them and the main point from each of these plots. So carbon is in the first plot, and at reducing conditions, carbon prefers to be exsolved in the gaseous phase as CO2. But as conditions become more oxidized, it will increasingly dissolve into magmas. Sulfur prefers to be dissolved into magmas at all conditions that were considered. Nitrogen is dissolved in magmas at reducing conditions, but becomes increasingly exsolved into the atmosphere at more oxidizing conditions. And for hydrogen, it could be in both the atmosphere and the magma at reducing conditions, but as conditions become more oxidizing, it will favor dissolution as water into magmas. And so this can give a first order, these kinds of maps can give first order idea of the atmospheric composition of planets and how that, and what kind of magmas would have produced these atmospheres. And with that, I will put up the summary for the first part of the talk, and I can take any questions about this material.
Question for part 1? Otherwise, we can wait maybe.
Yeah.
I guess we can just go first. I think we can just go on.
Sure. Okay, so moving on to the second part of the talk. When did Earth acquire its volatiles? And I don't necessarily have an answer for you, but it's a question that I have been thinking about. So there are two main hypotheses for when Earth acquired volatiles. The first one is homogeneous accretion, in which basically the Earth would have acquired the same type of material throughout its accretion. And the second hypothesis is heterogeneous accretion, in which the Earth accreted dry at first, but then volatiles were accreted later on. And there is evidence in the geochemical and the cosmochemical record for both of these processes. So analysis of meteoritic samples suggests that sourced from the inner solar system suggests that the highly volatiles were already present in our inner solar system very early on during planet formation. But the mantle's isotopic abundances in the moderate volatile elements tells us that at least some volatiles had to have accreted later on in Earth's history after differentiation had occurred. They have a primitive chondritic signature. So typically, the way how volatile accretion has been studied is by using noble gas isotopic systematics. But more recently, other elements, such as moderate volatiles, have been used as tracers for when these more highly volatile elements could have accreted. And so for this project, I explored two elements, palladium and silver, as possible tracers of volatile accretion, not just volatile accretion, but also early fractionation processes in the Earth. So volatile accretion and loss, as well as core formation. And these two elements, they have varying degree of iron-loving behavior. Palladium really likes to be in core form material, silver not so much. Silver additionally is a moderate volatile. So it has a low condensation temperature, not as low as the highly volatiles. And so when silver accreted, if we can figure out when silver accreted, that might help us understand when other volatiles accreted, or that's the idea. And these two elements are coupled by this isotope decay system, which has a time scale, a half-life decay of 6.5 million years, which makes the system relevant to tracing processes that would have been occurring within say 40 million years after the solar system formed. So the mantles signature of both of these elements show contradict, or the mantle isotopic and relative abundances of these two elements show contradict signatures. And in case someone doesn't know what chondrites are, these are primitive undifferentiated material that are oftentimes used as sort of bulk starting materials for planets. So they're sort of a compositional standards. And it appears that both palladium and silver in the mantle came from chondrites. So this would imply that both of them were accreted after core mantle differentiation, because there's no fractionation signature that can be detected currently. But we can't rule out these elements being delivered earlier in Earth's history. But what we do know is the abundance of these elements in the mantle today. We can measure the abundances in mantle rocks, and we have those. But we don't know how much came from late accretion, and we don't know how much would have come from core formation. We do know, however, that some of the mantle budget for these two elements were delivered in late accretion due to the contradict isotopic signatures. So what we set out to do was to understand how core formation would have affected the mantle budgets for these two elements. And I'll show you some data in the next few slides that we collected for these two elements. So we measured the metal-silicate partition coefficients of both of these elements at final equilibration conditions between the Earth's core and mantle. And this plot is very similar to the ones that I showed previously. Log of the partition coefficients are on the y-axis, temperatures are on the x-axis, inverse temperature. And the data, the blue and the green points are data collected from the literature that were carried out in other apparatuses that can access pressures up to 20 GPa and 2400 Kelvin. And the diamonds show the data that we collected in diamond anvil cells up to pressures of 70 GPa and temperatures of up to 7000 Kelvin in some cases. And I'm not showing all the data here. So this is just some of the data that we collected. And we carried out our fit to a functional form. And then we were plotting here these isobars to show how the partition coefficient would have evolved under different conditions of pressures and temperatures. And to first order, we can see that palladium becomes less iron loving under the conditions at which the Earth's core formed at. And this is the data set for silver. So same format as before, log partition coefficients on the y-axis and temperatures on the x-axis. The data set that are relevant to planetesimal formation in the blue and the green points, and the data that we collected are in the red points. And we fitted this together to a nice functional form, and we can calculate how the partition coefficient evolves over different pressure temperature conditions. And again, it is apparent that silver becomes less iron loving at the conditions relevant to Earth's core mantle equilibration. So we took these data and we applied them to models of differentiation to try and understand how differentiation would have affected the mantle composition of these two elements. And what we found was that core mantle differentiation in the Earth would have enriched the Earth's mantle in both of these elements relative to what we measure today. So that there's clearly a discrepancy between core mantle differentiation, what core mantle differentiation can put into the mantle, and what we're measuring. So something, another process must have been active in the Earth after core formation, before late accretion, to draw down the bulk of these elements into the core. But that process didn't have to remove all of these elements. There could still have been some left over from early processes before late accretion. And so this is a work in progress. We are still trying to reconcile these predictions with the measurement, with the measured compositions. But one thing that we cannot rule out at the moment is we can't rule out homogeneous accretion. There could be silver, there could have been silver and other volatiles delivered earlier in the mantle. And so some of the data that we might need to help us unravel these early processes are probably more partition coefficients, not just for silver, but for other moderately volatile elements whose signatures could reflect mixed processes. So we need more high pressure temperature data to better disentangle how the early Earth accreted volatiles and lost volatiles. And that is all I have for the second part of the talk. I can put up the summary and take any questions.
Okay, so part of the part 2, is there part 3?
There isn't a part 3. I just have my acknowledgement
slides.
Oh,
okay. Okay, so question from the audience. Okay, Colette has a question.
Yes.
Hi, Terry.
Hi, Colette. Thank you.
I'm curious. I'm obviously not an expert. I was curious about like the scatter that shows up in the plots that you make and whether that reflects some hidden variables that I'm not aware of, or is there just a lot of randomness in these experiments that just because they're difficult?
Does this plot show the scatter you're talking about? Or?
Yeah, all of these plots, like the fact that they're kind of all over the place. They're not like, they're not clearly lying on a line or anything like that.
Yeah, so there are a few other factors, such as like the capsule material that was used that could bias the results. And I tried to show that here in these colors, but they're very similar and they're hard to sort of pick apart in the figure. So I apologize for that. So that could be contributing to the spread. There's also large uncertainties on some of these measurements, and I am not showing the uncertainties because it would just make things really busy. So that could also be contributing to the spread. Does that help?
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, we have a second. There's a hand raised. Venkateswara. I don't know if I wrote your name correctly.
Thank you, Venkateswara. Right. Thank you. Hi, Terry. I have a question about your partition coefficient equation. You did mention about the uncertainty. So I'm curious, actually, you have in that right-hand side expression, you have temperature, pressure, but I'm curious how the partition coefficients are dependent also on the composition of the system you are investigating. And is there a possibility for us to estimate the uncertainty because of the compositions of these systems specifically, and put it onto the data?
So yeah, that's a great point. Thanks for bringing that up. So this is a simplified expression. There are compositional terms that would come after this term, such as the concentration of light elements in the metal parts of these experiments. And these can also be represented as various activities. But I am purposefully not showing those because I didn't want the equation to be too complicated. But yes, these expressions are way more complicated than the ones I'm showing here.
Thank you.
Okay, we have a question in chat. Arnold, would you like to just speak up?
Yeah, absolutely. Sure. Hi, Terry.
Hi.
So yeah, I had a question regarding your solubility models and the species that are outgassed from the magma ocean. How do you consider the fact that some species, I mean the speciation of species, and the fact that you don't have lots of oxygen for reduced conditions, for instance, and then you would probably outgas more, less carbon dioxide. So yeah, I was wondering if you consider that too.
So this modeling was done by my colleagues, Colin Jackson and Celia Deleu. So I think this is a great question for them. I don't know a lot about the details of the models.
All right, thank you.
Okay, Steve.
Hi there. Let me see. Can I can't use my
You can turn on video.
what was that? I can't turn on my video. That was a great talk. Thank you very much for presenting all this information. I've noticed that people either model partitioning as sort of a single stage event at a single pressure and temperature, or they go to a homogeneous sort of continuous delivery. And I'm wondering about the in-between thing where we know that Theia and Proto-Earth merged and their cores must have merged. So there must have been two single stage events. And in particular, in my 2019 paper, I put down the redox temperature and pressure for Earth, Proto-Earth and Theia. So there's particular cases that could be modeled. Have those sort of two single stage models been considered?
There's been work done using continuous core formation models and also multi-stage core formation models. So I suspect that this has been explored.
I don't think it has, and that it's kind of perplexing me. I mean, yeah, you can have multi-stage, but just exactly two single stage events, each with a very distinct, like iron wüstite -2 for one of them and iron wüstite -5 for another of them with specific conditions. I kind of suspect it hasn't been done.
Yeah, I'm not aware of this being done, but I think it would be very interesting.
Okay, well, yeah, I'd like to send you like my particular ideas and maybe you could try them.
Yeah, that would be great.
Okay, cool, thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, any other question?
I have a question.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry, this is a multi-part question that's going to reflect how little I know about this. But okay, so our understanding of the volatile element budget in the core is mostly based on seismometry, right, to get density measurements. Is that correct?
I would say that's one part of it, yeah.
Oh, okay.
The other part is studying how the density of iron changes if you try to put different components in it. So the seismology measurements itself doesn't tell us what the elements are, but you can measure the density in the laboratory and try to match those with what seismology gives us. And the elements that seem to match the core density deficit the best are these volatiles. So yeah.
Okay, cool. I was curious whether we have similar information for any other solar system bodies, like particularly I think we've sent a seismometer to Mars, correct? Can that do the same type of measurements for Mars's core?
Yes, and I think there has been recent work done on sort of modeling which light element could have gotten incorporated into the Martian core. And silver is one of them, but also hydrogen and oxygen. So,
okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Any other question? I have a question. What is the
Yes.
so when you actually do which measurements is really the hardest to get?
Oh, they're both hard. Controlling the oxygen fugacity is the hardest thing to do in both of these types of experiments.
So how do you control that actually?
So in the you can put a material whose redox behavior you understand well, like iron and iron oxide, and use that to sort of buffer the conditions in your experiment. And so that's what's typically done. But in the diamond anvil cell experiments, there's no way to really buffer the redox. So the condition, yeah.
Thank you. Okay, if there's no any other question, last call for question. Terry Ann is here, so if you're locally here, would like to meet with Terry Ann, let us know. I'll let you know where she is sitting. All right, let's thank Terry Ann again. Thank you.